For those logging on, we're just going to give it a minute for others to do so before we get started. Thank you. A very good evening to those in India and the East, good afternoon to Europe, and good morning to those waking up in the United States. My name is Rudra Chaudhuri. I'm the director of Carnegie India. It gives me great pleasure in welcoming you to the 7th in our India and the World webinar series on and around COVID-19. We at Carnegie India are committed to bring to you top-line analysis based on deep and collaborative research, especially in this time of a complex health emergency. The pandemic has deepened the fault lines across issues around globalization, international cooperation, global trade, the potential for factor market reforms, the future of work, the import of technology, the balance between privacy and contact tracing, the role of the international and the rise of the national. These are only some of the areas of interest for our scholars and research teams to investigate and explore. Our work on COVID-19 is organized in a dedicated webpage accessible through our website carnegieindia.org. Today's webinar is titled U.S China Rivalry, India's Choices. That the Sino-American relationship has taken a structural turn seems more clear today than in the recent past. The fact that the US and China, perhaps for the first time in this century, have been unable and unwilling to cooperate at a time of global crisis is telling. India shares a 3,488-kilometer long border with the People's Republic of China. The ongoing standoff between Indian and Chinese forces along the LAC, or the line of actual control, raises more questions than answers. Whilst policy experts are divided on what has driven the PLA to engage in adventurism on the Indian side of the LAC and across multiple places at the same time, the likelihood of a diplomatic solution is perhaps more likely, however, than not. To be sure, both India and China have cooperated during the COVID-19 crisis. Chinese capital partially bankrolls many of India's startups. Till only a few months ago, the nature of the discussion between the two sides focused on the potential of opening each other's markets. So, and at present, where does all of this leave India, a country that has historically experimented with balancing acts in the three-way relationship between itself and the two economic and military giants? Should the geopolitical shifts underway at present afford India an opportunity to pivot to a new ring of partnerships led and made up of middle powers? What exactly are the choices that India will need to make in the ever-intensifying and even ugly battle of ideas and interests between the United States and China? To examine these questions and fault lines, we are joined by a very special set of speakers, Paul Haenle, General Narasimhan, Tanvi Madan, and Santosh Pai. Paul Haenle holds the Maurice Greenberg Director's Chair at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center, based at Tsinghua University in Beijing, China. In addition to running the center, Paul is also an adjunct professor at Tsinghua, where he teaches undergraduate and graduate level courses to Chinese and international students. He also sits on the board of directors of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Prior to joining Carnegie, Paul served from June 2007 to June 2009 as a director of China, Taiwan, and Mongolia Affairs for the National Security Council staffs of former US presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, following his retirement from the US Army as a lieutenant colonel. From June 2007 to January 2009, Paul also played a key role as the White House representative to the US negotiating team at the six-party talks nuclear negotiations. From May 2004 to 2007, he served as the executive assistant to the US National Security Advisor. General Narasimhan, retired, is an infantry officer who served in the Indian Army for 40 years. He has done his graduation in mathematics, his post-graduation in defense studies, and has a PhD in India-China relations. General Narasimhan served as a defense attaché in the Embassy of India in China for 3 years and is qualified in the Chinese language. His expertise spans international relations and internal issues, economy, and defense subjects related to China. General Narasimhan is presently a member of the National Security Advisory Board, Government of India. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi. Dr. Tanvi Madan is a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Foreign Policy Program and director of the India Project at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Tanvi's work explores India's role in the world and its foreign policy, focusing in particular on India's relations with China and the United States. She is the author of the fabulous book, Fateful Triangle: How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War, published by the Brookings Institutional Press earlier this year. She is currently completing a monograph on India's foreign policy diversification strategy and researching her next book on the China-India-US triangle. Santosh Pai is an international corporate lawyer with over 16 years of work experience gained in India, China, the United Kingdom, and Thailand. Santosh is currently a partner at Link Legal India Law Services, as well as an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, or ICS, in New Delhi. He's also a member of the core group on China at the Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, as well as chair, East Asia Board, and global trustee at an international NGO. His books, India Company Law and Practical Guide on Investing in India for Chinese Investors, were translated into Chinese and published by China Law Press in 2019 and 17, respectively. He's proficient in the Chinese language. Before I turn to our guests, a couple of housekeeping points. We have over 300 people on this webinar joining us both on Zoom as well as on YouTube Live. Hence, taking vocal questions will be very difficult. However, for those on Zoom, please add your question to the Q&A box at the bottom center of your page. For those on YouTube, please add your questions on the comment section. They will come to me in real time, and I will take them back to the panelists. With that, could I please turn to Paul for his opening remarks and perhaps help us frame the debate for the discussion today?
Well, thank you very much, Rudy. It's a pleasure to be on this panel today. And it's just a delight to have you as my Carnegie counterpart in New Delhi. You're an outstanding scholar, a great institution builder, and an entrepreneur. And it's a pleasure to work with you. I'm also pleased to be on this distinguished panel. When you went through those bios, I thought, wow, this is quite a panel. And I look forward to the discussion. I look forward to learning from the panelists. You had asked me earlier to talk about the current and deep friction and tension between the US and China. Why have we not, the US and China, been able to cooperate, unlike in the past, on the coronavirus? And what does the near term look like with reference to some of the more delicate issues, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and some of the areas of tension in the US-China relationship? Let me start by just saying that the US-China relationship, in my view, is in a state of disrepair. I have worked on the relationship, as you said, for quite some time now, including serving as the China director for both President Bush and President Obama. We have seen over the last 2 to 3 years a deterioration in the US-China relationship. Many of us thought that the coronavirus, a global pandemic, would provide an opportunity for the US and China to set aside hostilities, to set aside disagreements and politics, and come together to cooperate on the coronavirus in a manner that would save lives in America, in China, and the rest of the world. What's interesting is during my work on in the US government on China through official channels and through unofficial channels now with the Carnegie Endowment over the last 10 years, US and China has always agreed that global pandemics and disease control is an area that the US and China would come together and cooperate regardless of the state of the relationship. And this has not happened. I was in the Department of Defense serving as a US Army officer in the early days of the Bush administration, when we had a crisis between the US and China with our Navy aircraft EP-3 colliding with a Chinese aircraft. That was a very tense situation in the early days of the Bush administration. It looked like we were going to move to a more hostile relationship with China in the early days of the Bush administration. It was 9/11 and the global war on terror that brought the US and China together. And we were able to forge a more constructive path over the 8 years of the Bush administration. I was serving as China director during the global financial crisis in the end of 2008, in the fall of 2008. The first phone President Bush made to a world leader to begin the global response to the global financial crisis was to Chinese President Hu Jintao to say, we need to work together to be able to get through this crisis together and to recover the global economy. Some of us had expected that there would be some effort like this in response to coronavirus. Early on, I wrote an article with my colleague at Carnegie, Lucas Chayan, arguing that U.S. China collaboration to diminish the spread of the virus would be very, very important, and would be a chance for both countries to demonstrate we can cooperate in times of crisis. Early on, that was not the case, but it's actually worse than that, because the situation between the U.S. and China devolved into an ugly blame game, and deliberate efforts by both sides to try to inflict damage on the other side. We saw in China a disinformation campaign, not just through Chinese state media, but actually within the foreign ministry and the deputy foreign ministry spokesman pushing a narrative that the virus may have originated in the United States and brought to China by the US military. In the United States, we saw senior Trump administration officials, most notably the president himself, calling the virus the Chinese virus, and the Secretary of State calling it the Wuhan virus. And this created huge animosity in China and anger towards the United States. I've participated in a number of unofficial dialogues between the US and China during this time. As you probably know, the official dialogue between China and the United States, the dialogue mechanisms that existed in previous administrations, have largely been pulled down. And the only dialogue channel that really exists is in the trade negotiations between the trade representative Lighthizer and the Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin and their counterpart Liu He in China. But the other official dialogue mechanisms have been pulled down by the Trump administration. So there's not a lot of opportunity to dialogue over these important issues. So the unofficial track 2 dialogues have been very important during this time. And at Carnegie, we have been involved in a lot of these. In these dialogues, I will tell you, there is strong agreement between former US officials, former Chinese officials, scholars and experts on both sides, that the blame game is counterproductive both for the US and for China and for the international community. There's strong agreement we should be putting aside differences and politics to deal with the crisis at hand. But where we are stuck, frankly, is how to convince our respective leaderships that that is the case. And this is partly due, I think, to a completely divergent view by senior US and Chinese government officials. In China, we hear that Chinese side is feeling kicked while China is down. The Chinese phrase is throwing stones on me while I'm falling down the well. And this is damaging Chinese views of America and increasing resentment there. The Trump administration is equally defensive and angry. When I talk to the vice president's office or the National Security Council, I hear they feel they're under constant attack, and that China is trying to use the coronavirus global pandemic in opportunistic ways to get a strategic advantage at the expense of the United States. And in all fairness, these views are only reinforced when decisions are made at the National People's Congress to enact a national security law on Hong Kong, and the ongoing tensions between China and India at the border and moves by China to try to seize an opportunity. We see more military exercises around Taiwan by China. And so this is all leading the Trump administration to have a view that China is trying to take advantage of the coronavirus when the world is focused, countries are focused on trying to get their domestic situation in order, that China has a strategic opportunity to advance objectives in other areas. So this is coupled with what we see increasingly coming out of China called the wolf warrior approach to diplomacy, which is now being taken by many Chinese diplomats. And this only increases antagonistic views. Diplomats, upwards of 60 to 70 ambassadors and senior diplomats across the world, Chinese diplomats have joined Twitter and Facebook platforms I would remind you that are censored and blocked in China. But their diplomats are getting out and punching back to criticism about China, and even proactively punching without responding to anything when they see something that they don't like or that they don't feel aligns with Chinese preferences. And so, in my view, no one wins when Beijing accuses the US military of bringing the coronavirus to China, or when senior US officials call the coronavirus the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. So what does this all mean for the near future, and especially as we approach the presidential election in November here in the United States? Unfortunately, I think we can expect the situation to get much worse. I think we're entering a fairly dangerous period over the next 6 months, and I think it's one that we have to be very careful about. The Chinese leadership, as my friend at CSIS put it recently, Jude Planchette, mentioned that the Chinese leadership is feeling both empowered, but they're also feeling exasperated or frustrated. They're empowered because I think they see the gap with the US and China narrowing. They see the balance of power shifting in a way that's to China's advantage. And they see a unique opportunity to seize on the disorder that's been brought about by both Trump's America First policy and the coronavirus global pandemic. And they're seizing on this to advance core interests like Hong Kong and other areas. But they also feel frustrated and exasperated that despite their rise in global power and influence and global status, they're not getting the respect that they might have expected or feel that they are due. And the fact that they are facing growing international blowback from a growing number of countries. And so the confluence of these two conflicting emotions, both feeling more empowered, but also feeling exasperated, is leading to a rising number of flashpoints in Chinese engagement with the world, and especially with the United States. In the US, we're seeing public sentiment shift pretty dramatically in terms of favorable or unfavorable views to China. 2/3 of Americans now have an unfavorable view of China. That is up 20 percentage points from just 2 years ago. 62% of Americans view China as a major threat, and that's also up from 48% 2 years ago. The negative sentiment that we see, in my view, will probably continue to go down as we see messaging from both President Trump and his reelection campaign and Vice President Biden, the Democratic nominee, who will try to argue that the other puts the US in a weaker position in dealing with China. Basically, they will argue that they are each tougher on China than the other. The Republican Party has already distributed talking points shifting the blame for the coronavirus squarely on China, including recommendations that Republicans ought to say things like, the virus came from China, China covered it up, it was a Chinese hit and run, followed by a cover-up that cost thousands of American lives. And both Trump and Biden have videos out showing how tough they are to China. I think we might really see the bottom fall out if Trump decides he no longer needs the phase one trade deal that was agreed to in January, if he feels that China's not honoring that deal, or for some political reasons, he needs to back out. Up until now, the dynamic we have seen in the Trump administration is that, in a strange way, President Trump has been a key restraint on more aggressive action by the Trump administration on China. Hawks within the Trump administration have been pushing for a much more aggressive policy on China, but President Trump has wanted a trade deal, and he has pushed a lot of those more provocative or aggressive proposals back to the U.S. interagency. If a trade deal collapses, which it increasingly is looking like it could happen, that may empower those around him that want to enact a range of new policies targeting Beijing and ramping up hostilities even more. To give you an idea of the growing magnitude of US legislation being passed, over the past 60 days, the past 2 months, lawmakers in Congress have proposed more than 24 bills on China relating to the coronavirus and punitive actions towards China. So to close out my initial comments, I just want to highlight 5 areas of the relationship that we'll be watching going forward in the coming months that are going to, I think, represent increasing friction between the US and China. Number one, obviously the trade and economic. This has been front and center from day one of President Trump coming into office, his obsession on trade deficit. And as I said, if the trade deal collapses, we may see the US, impose new tariffs on China. China could retaliate. There's ongoing debates around decoupling, moving global supply chains out of China. The second area I think to watch very closely is in technology. The president of the U.S. China Business Council likes to say that the trade war will morph into a technology war. And I think we're already seeing that. We see actions enhancing regulations that prevent Beijing from buying sensitive technology from the US, implementing a growing number of export controls in the US to circumscribe China's access to semiconductors and other advanced technologies. And we've seen a number of new policies in just the last month alone. The third area is, of course, security. This is the area that could lead to, frankly, a direct conflict between the two countries if we have some sort of miscalculation or inadvertent clash in the South China Sea. As Beijing, as I mentioned, advances objectives on Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea, Washington responds by building up its own military presence in the region. The risk of an inadvertent clash grows stronger, and possibilities of conflict there. Not to mention, of course, North Korea, a potential regional security crisis there that could escalate into a conflict. And we saw the tensions go up when Kim Jong-un went missing for a number of days earlier this spring. Fourth, I think, is a financial war between the US and China. This would likely see the US leverage the importance of its financial system to try to punish China. China accounted for more than 25% of global GDP growth in 2018, but its currency still makes up less than 2% of all assets held by central banks in the world and only 1% of the international payments market. In a financial war, the US could implement restrictions that curbs China's access to US dollars, which it needs to pay off debt and buy everything from foreign companies and computer chips to oil and grain. The fifth area and the last area I'll mention is growing ideological war, influence war. We're seeing both countries put forth policies that don't just de-link our economies, but de-link our people and the flow of information between the US and China. Tit for tat expulsions in Beijing and Washington of reporters and journalists. We're now entering new territory with growing discussions about enacting policies that would limit the access of 350,000 Chinese students that go to the United States every year and study in US universities. So these are 5 areas which over the next 6 months and beyond, depending on what happens in November, could even worsen between the US and China. And these are the trend lines as we see them today.
Paul, thank you so much. And if I could return the personal compliment, you are the standard at Carnegie, which many of us seek to follow. And I think your introductory remarks suggest why. If I could turn to General Narasimhan, sir, there are geopolitical wolf warriors, but then there are also very real wolf warriors on countries' borders. How does India seek to negotiate what is clearly a testing time in international politics?
Thanks, Rudra, and my compliments to Paul for an excellent initial remarks. I'm sure more will come during the question and answer session. I wanted to start with the quote with the Chinese generally say, we live in interesting times. So I'm sure we'll all agree that we live in interesting times. The second thing I wanted to start with was, Field Marshal Vaughan Paulus of 6th Army, when he was fighting his last battle, or just penultimate battle. He said, look, my forces are all surrounded. My right is crumbling. my left is collapsing, but I'm attacking. So the issue that I wanted to explain with that is the whole world seems to be going through a churning in international relations. The economy is becoming a worrying factor, combined with the fact that COVID does not help at all in any manner. All the countries have been affected by this. So I think what all the countries are trying to do is to attack when they were under this kind of a pressure to come out of that particular scenario that they see themselves in. So having said that, what I would probably cover in my initial remarks is how India-China relations have panned out over a period of time, and what we see today is something that I wanted to cover. There was the initial period after both the countries became one became Republic of India and the other one became People's Republic of China. Initial period till about 1955-60 was reasonably all right, and the slogans of Chini, Indi Chini, bye bye, etc. were coming up around that time. Starting from about 1957, the relations started going south, and it resulted in the 1962 war. And thereafter, there was a hiatus in the relationship. Hardly anything moved till about 1988, though the diplomatic relations were started in 76. Till 1988, hardly there was any movement. But if you look at the period from 1988 till about 2005 and little beyond that, you found a fairly stable kind of relationship. There were some issues coming up and going, but you found that on the boundary issue, you found a number of agreements being signed, the 1993 agreement, the 1996 agreement, then the guiding principles on the political parameters in 2005. Then it was till around that time, you found that border was not such a huge issue, except one incident happened, that is in 1986 in Samdrug. That took a long time actually to disengage. It took years to disengage from that particular standoff that we had. Coming to 2005 and beyond, you find around 2012, you signed the Border Defense Cooperation Agreement, and then the working mechanism also started working. The period between 2013 and till now seems to have been more issue prone, in the sense that 2013, you found the standoff that was taking place in the Depsang Bulge, 2014 in Chumar, 2017 in Dolam, and in 2020 now in both Sikkim as well as in Eastern Ladakh. So this is how the relationship has panned out. What I wanted to say was, the India-China relations have always been a seesaw kind of a thing. Sometimes it becomes more stable, sometimes it has its own problems. So somewhere down the line, you find slowly and steadily that seesaw comes to a balance, and then it keeps going. So hopefully, even around this time, when we are having a lot of issues with them at this point in time in the border, hopefully there are other talks that are scheduled on the 6th of June. Hopefully, we will come to some kind of an understanding, and then we'll go ahead with that. In between this 2013 and 2020, there was again a period of little stability when the Wuhan summit took place in 2017. Things started looking up. Some agreements were made during that time. Some understanding came up, and you found the border incidents went down between 2017 and 2019. It is not so much. You found none of the reports were coming up around that time. Now the question comes up, why now? Why now is a question that always keeps coming in everybody's mind, and there are many theories that are around. My theory seems to be this, that you find that the infrastructure development has been taking place. The Darbuk Shiok DBO road, which has been in so much of limelight in the recent past, it came up quite well. It was inaugurated recently by our Defense Minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh. What happens when this infrastructure develops is that you find the number of patrols and the easy way of reaching those areas increases. Once that happens, then you find more face-offs also do take place. So here in this scenario, this is something like that which has happened. And therefore, once they came into face-off, the issues started. Now the question will come up, okay, what are the differences that have happened during this time and the ones which have happened before? The ones which have happened before actually were standalone in nature. When one place was getting actually into an issue, you found the other places were not activated. This time around, you find that Sikkim also had an issue, Pankungso had an issue, and also the Galwan Valley had an issue. So it is a wider kind of an area that gets covered at this point in time. Earlier, one could also feel that probably it was a local incident that got flared up. Now, when such a geographical dislocation or geographical separation is there between these events, you find that probably it was little coordinated at a higher level, at least at the Western Theatre Command. So this is something whether CMC knew or didn't know that we don't know at this point in time. But later on, in any case, they would have come to know because things went public, and then they would have come to know on that. That is the second difference. The third difference happened in the number of troops that came. You find that the number of people who were involved in the earlier skirmishes were more this time. So that is the third difference that comes up. The fourth difference that comes up is the aggressive behavior. It is not that earlier aggressive behavior was not noticed. You found when Dolam issue was happening in Sikkim, you find in Pankungso there was again earlier also in 2017, you found stone throwing, etc. happening between the troops. So there is a fourth one which can come up to say that the aggressive behavior seems to be a little more aggressive this time. So these are the four points I would like to mention, that those are the differences that we see in these incidents that have come up. The other thing is, lot of people have written about it. Even when I say this infrastructure development has resulted in this, a lot of analysts have questioned me also. That is fair. I mean, I've got no issues with that. The point that we need to understand is most of the people who are writing anywhere from outside that area are all speculating mainly. Nobody has gone and seen what has happened on the ground, and they are writing from hearsay here and there, and so that creates certain amount of issues. One more difference I would like to point out. In 2017, in the Dolam issue, the Chinese media went really ballistic. I mean, they were really very, very aggressive in the reporting, etc. This time around, you find Global Times, of course, has written a few articles, but other than that, if you look at the other media, they have been fairly quiet on this issue. So therefore, these are the 4 or 5 differences I see. Starting at the moment, let me cover up a little more on what is happening so that I can then cover up 1 or 2 points and then finish off. Starting after that first day's face-off that took place where the aggressive behavior is noticed, thereafter you found that there was no kind of animosity or escalation of tempers on the border. In fact, at the local level, the commanders have been speaking to each other, higher level meetings have taken place, and the next one is scheduled on the 6th of June. Hopefully, things will get resolved over a period of time. If somebody is asking me when it will get resolved, I'm not an astrologer, and so I won't be able to predict it at this point in time. But I'm sure somewhere down the line, this is going to happen. The other things I'm sure, India, US, I'm sure Tanvi will cover up in more detail, and so I'm not going to cover so much into that. But when you look at India, China, and India, US relations, if you want to see India's choices, then you need to understand both these relations. So on the Indian-US relations, I'll just make 1 or 2 points. I'll leave the rest to Tanvi. There have been steady progress, is what I see. You found over a period of time, you find this 2005 Defense Cooperation Agreement took place. The nuclear supply group waiver was supported by US. And then you found the other 2 agreements being signed, the Kamkasa, the Lemova, etc. have been signed. Becca, I believe, is in advanced stage of negotiations. Hopefully, that will also get signed in some time. So the only thing that comes up is where many people do ask this question: why is not improving faster than what it is? So that is something which I think we need to take it with a little pinch of salt to say that yes, there has been a steady progress, and there will be further steady progress probably, but it is not going to be so fast as people have expected it to be. That is one thing I wanted to say this. And then lastly, there are a lot of commonality of interest between India and US. That is also to be seen. We are looking at freedom of navigation, we are looking at freedom of passage, and we are overflight and other rule-based order, etc., etc. So there are a lot of congruencies there. I am sure these congruencies will work to better the relationship. But as I see it, it is not going to be India-China or India-US. It is going to be somewhere in between, is what I feel. With that, I'll stop here and take the questions subsequently whenever they come. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And before I come to Tanvi on the in-between space and how India can negotiate that, if I can just ask one question, sir. You mentioned, you gave a range of reasons as to why the current impasse is quite different to the ones in the past. The question I had is, between 1993 and 2013, there were a range of milestones that could be read as far as the Sino-Indian relationship was concerned, whether it's political parameters, whether it's confidence building measures, exchange of notes between NSAs, etc. But since 2013, that nature of the dialogue seems to have changed. It seems to have become more top-down, which was most visible in the following the Doklam crisis at Wuhan. It was leader-led, it was the prime minister, it was President Xi Jinping on the part of China. Do you think in the current, given the current impasse, is there a verve or is there a basic will to return to the negotiating table as far as China is concerned? And is that vacuum or gap seen as one of the reasons why perhaps at some level, some of the rails have gone wary?
There can be many reasons attributed to why things have gone this way. That's a different issue. We'll cover it some other time. As I see it, what has happened, even during things where chips were down in Dolam, when the incident was happening, there was no breakage in communication at any point in time. Diplomats were talking. I mean, the diplomacy was working. People were talking there. On the ground, again, people were talking there. There was no break in communication as has occurred at that time. Similar thing we see now. Even though these incidents have happened, at the ground level, again, the people are talking. At the diplomatic level, again, the people are talking. And I'm sure at the higher level also, from the government to government, people must be talking. So given all this, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that we'll be able to return back to where we left and then start the discussions on the boundary and other issues.
Thank you, sir. So Tanvi, if I could take it to you, how optimistic are you about these middle spaces or in-between spaces in what is clearly now a period of shifting geopolitics? You're a historian. You have long worked on this triangular relationship, best example in your kind of fabulous book, Fateful Triangle. So how do we frame and how do we think about the way India can negotiate the present and the future?
Thanks, Rudy. And it's really great to be on this very distinguished panel and excellent timing as well. I thought what I'd do is, step back a bit and look at, as General Narasimhan did, some differences and similarities with what we've seen before in terms of the triangular dynamics between the U.S., China, and India, but also kind of the choice that India is facing in the context of that choice. So if you look at just the U.S., China, India triangle per se, these are countries, if you think about it vis-a-vis the past, China and India's power and global and regional roles are different, especially relative to a number of other countries than they were, say, during the Cold War. The bilateral relationships involved, all three sets, are very different than they used to be. And when it comes to the triangular relationship, what we kind of saw pre-2000 was different than what we see today. So particularly during the 80s and 90s, you saw a US that was enabling China's rise. And a US partnership that, in fact, in some ways, especially vis-a-vis, if you think about it in the Pakistan context, the Afghanistan context, actually hindered some of India's interests. But if you go back further than that, to actually the period General Narasimhan mentioned, you actually see a similarity between today's situation. That is, a US and India that share concerns about China, and that forming the basis for a strategic partnership. And you really saw that around that time that General Narasimhan mentioned, that kind of 1957 period through the 1960s. And you see kind of, so you hear a lot of echoes of that time today. Things like the US wants to see India's rise and a democratic India serve as a counterbalance and contrast to China, and therefore it was in US interest to support that rise. And so I think you do see similarities. But it's interesting how these kind of differences and similarities manifest themselves. And just one example I'll give you, it's related to something Paul said, which is one manifestation of just the change dynamic between today and what we saw in, say, the 80s, is export controls. In the 80s and 90s, it was India, and even in the 2000s, to some extent. Export controls that limited India are now actually going to limit China in ways that, frankly, could possibly benefit India. So just kind of taking it even a step further back and looking at not just the triangle, But kind of related to that, some differences and similarities between kind of the bipolar competition that we're seeing that Indian policymakers had to tackle and deal with during the Cold War and the one it faces today with U.S. China competition intensifying. And we'll see what happens after the November elections here in the U.S. But the intensity of competition does seem to be increasing. We'll see how far, we'll see what the approach the U.S. takes. Some of the differences between kind of this kind of major power competition and the bipolar competition of the Cold War. One, the two antagonists, at least, they do have economic ties, but so does India with both countries in a way that it did not in the Cold War. There's a degree of economic interdependence involved. Second, in this competition that we're seeing, Asia is at the center of it. It's not a secondary theater. Third, India actually has, unlike with the US-Soviet competition, India has direct disputes with one of the antagonists involved, that is China. And disputes that have been expanding in nature and intensity over the last few years. So it's not just the boundary. You could solve the boundary issue tomorrow, and there would still be a range of concerns India would have about China. Another kind of difference is, and this is potentially to India's advantage, and could actually help its options and kind of the choices that it makes, going back to your question, is the configuration of power. This is something the historian Melvin Leffler points out, that today, in between the US and China, there are a lot of other powers that are kind of more middle powers, not what you saw the countries leading the Northern Line movement, which were a lot of recently decolonized countries just coming out, trying to focus on economic development. Whether it's Australia, whether it's Japan, whether it's kind of France, whether it's Indonesia, there's a lot of middle powers now that are more powerful relative to other countries than they were during the Cold War. And these other countries don't have more power, but they're likely to have more agency and more options. The other kind of difference that I think will kind of affect India is India in the Cold War, and will likely try to do this again, which is create space for itself, and try to help its interests by playing one off against the other, by using this superpower rivalry, while trying to insulate itself from the worst aspects of it, or kind of from the fallout of it. But now India, as one of those kind of larger powers, will also find itself, to a greater degree than during the Cold War, that it'll find other countries also playing off India against China, particularly in its neighborhood. We saw this in the 50s with Nepal. Nepal has done this for ages, but now we'll see it, I suspect, with a far larger number of countries in India's neighborhood, and even kind of the Indian Ocean region more broadly. And so India will actually have to deal with other countries diversifying their portfolio of partners and playing one off against the other. Just a few similarities. I mean, one thing we are going to see as Indian policymakers look out to this bipolar competition, and it's not because they are a multipolar competition, but this US-China competition, however it plays out, is one that it does seem to be, and this is similarity, it does seem to be, which seem to be setting in for long-term cooperation between two powers that are ideologically different. And we're seeing an increasing, at least rhetorical sense, that the two countries care about the kind of political and economic systems and what prevails. The other similarities, this is going to be, as the Cold War was, a competition across domains: geopolitical, economic, technological, ideological. There's also going to be the similar situation where decisions of other actors will matter, not just the middle powers I mentioned, but for example, for India, as it looks at this US-China competition, but also as it looks at this US-China-India trilateral, other actors, what will Russia do? What will Pakistan do? That actually will matter, just as it did in the Cold War. Another similarity, and this will lead me to kind of final few points I'll make about India's choices, is I think India's objectives largely remain the same as they have. They have been fairly consistent, which is to protect its security, economic prosperity, establishing a role in the world to be able to shape India's ecosystem, but also preserving strategic autonomy, which is decision-making space. And so I think as India goes forward, policymakers will try to kind of balance these interests, which is protect India's geopolitical, economic security interest while maintaining its decision-making space. And so what this will translate to, I suspect, is engaging China where possible, because it can help even now, despite all the restrictions, and Santosh will talk about these, in the economic sense and in kind of economic prosperity. but also engaging China to kind of balance and mitigate against some of the things it could do to harm India's interests. But I think the other thing that India will do is compete, as it has been doing. And I think we've seen this now over the last few years across governments in India of all stripes, which is we've seen India competing when necessary, building capabilities, but also through a network of partnerships, even alignments, you can say, with the US and other powers. And so even as, and with a big assist from China, let's remember that after Doklam, India and the US, but not just India and the US, India, Japan, India, Australia, India, France, India, Indonesia, India has intensified its engagement, particularly defense and security with these countries. And so I think India will do this kind of competing and engaging with China with, I would say, suspect an emphasis on competing given Chinese actions. As far as the US is concerned, I think India will use it as much as it can, while perhaps minimizing how much it gets used. And so I think this is always a balance between two. And I think at the end of the day, India's ability, though, to kind of balance this security, economy, and autonomy imperatives will really depend on its own ability to develop its own capabilities, because I think that will make a huge difference to what its China kind of concerns look like, but also how it can expand options in terms of partnerships and what role it can play. But it will also depend on India's ability to not just maintain and expand its partnership with, say, like-minded powers, as they're called these days, but how it uses these partnerships to build those very capabilities to ensure favorable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and even continental Asia. But I think it will also depend on China's behavior and intentions. There is nothing that has driven perhaps US-India. Yes, there are a lot of factors driving US-India together, but we would not see the kind of India-US, or for example, since there's been an Australia-India summit today, an Australia-India kind of set of cooperations across technology, economy, security, if it wasn't for concerns in Delhi about Chinese behavior. And so I think Beijing can actually do a lot to shape how far India goes, and needs to kind of factor that into its decisions. So I just say India will make choices. It's not going to be like a lot of Southeast Asians say, we don't want to make choices. I think India will make choices. They just won't be necessarily bloc-based or ideology-based. They will, as former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale has pointed out, as Foreign Minister Jaishankar, they'll be issue-based. And a key issue will be protecting India's security as well as its regional space. And so I think you will see bilateral, trilateral, many lateral partnerships, because I don't think the US has shown the kind of reliability, particularly over the last few years, that India will only depend on the US. But I think you'll also see what I like to call floating coalitions. You've seen a number of them already, including the Quad Plus discussing the Indo-Pacific Coordination Group in the kind of COVID era. So it'll do these things while continuing to engage China where possible.
Tanvi, thanks so much. And I'm going to come back to you on some of this India's diversification approach. And we've got a lot of questions on that. But Santosh Pai, can you just bring us down from the geopolitical to the zone of money, finance, and economics? You're someone who advises Chinese companies in India in the current shift, when the rage is all about diversifying supply chains, pivoting to new realities. How does that relationship get affected? And what are Chinese companies saying with regards to India in the near future?
Thanks, Rudy. I have an unfair advantage of being up, so I'll take advantage of all the contextualizing done by my previous speakers. And yes, I will try to address these two questions as well. So I'd just like to peg this on a few trends which have driven the U.S. China economic relationship, which has a causal impact over the last 10 years or so on India-China economic ties. I have identified them as the starting point being the financial recession, which was the first time when Chinese companies started looking for alternative markets to move away or reduce their dependency on the US. And then the subsequent CFIUS regime, which constantly started scrutinizing Chinese investments. And then, of course, you have the trade war, and before that, the anti-dumping duties against Chinese companies, and finally, the Trump era. So I think all of these pegs have had an impact on the growth, I would say, between India and China economic ties. For instance, in 2008 was exactly the year when became India's largest trading partner. And 2010 was around the time when India and China decided to decouple their political and economic ties to realize the full potential. And then, of course, 2014, we had Make in India being launched with a major courting of Chinese companies, bonhomie between the political leaders, so on and so forth. And then 2015 was when this whole Chinese investments into the startups exploded. Not due to any government action, but merely due to the fact that the smartphone penetration in India crossed 20%. So this is a very less known fact. So this is the statistics which actually drove the giants like Alibaba and Tencent in the domestic market. So when they saw India crossing this threshold, they immediately brought out their checkbooks for the Indian market, because that actually gave them the potential of the Indian ecosystem. So now where are we? Trade has peaked around in 2018. When the trade war started, I think a lot of trade diversion happened, and 2019 was actually a dip. Investment has continued to grow. India today has by and large cemented its place as a high growth, large, emerging economy with long-term prospects for Chinese companies. So that is a big achievement that India has managed. And of course, in the VC space, India has now become the most attractive space, arguably, in the world. Now, when it comes to data, there have been a lot of reports recently in India, especially in the first half of this year, on Chinese investments in India. Mainly, they look at the quantitative aspects of it. So depending on whether you trust DIPP statistics exclusively or you correlate the other sort of statistics from media, you will arrive at a number of somewhere between 10 to 15 billion US dollars as Chinese investments in India. My own estimate is much higher, but it's difficult to sort of pin it down and put it on an Excel sheet. So that is the quantitative exposure. But today I would like to take this opportunity to turn your attention towards the qualitative role played by Chinese investment, because things will actually decide what path India takes in managing its economic ties with China, with all these current situation that we have discussed so far. So there's three pillars really. One is the manufacturing pillar, where Chinese companies have started manufacturing in India for the domestic market and also for export, largely driven by US actions in the past, also in part. So today, India, in a small way, is starting to make its presence felt in supply chain globally, and Chinese players are an essential part of it. So that is the manufacturing pillar. And on the infrastructure, which is the second pillar I identified, initially, I think India wanted Chinese investments to come into the infrastructure space. For many reasons, this did not materialize. And at the same time, India boycotted BRI. So China has actually today come around, seeing India's point, and is now channeling all the Chinese investment through multilateral institutions like AIIB and New Development Bank into India. So again, this I count as a win for India, because we were actually able to push back on Chinese investments and get it through a multilateral mechanism, which is easier to manage. And the third pillar, I would say, is the digital economy. Now, it's no coincidence that 18 out of 23 unicorns in India have Chinese investors. Because if you ask any founder of an Indian startup, he will tell you that Chinese money comes with a lot of value-added experience and learnings from China, which is frankly the only market today which India wants to sort of, model itself when it comes to these kind of new areas. E-commerce, ride-hailing, and so on and so forth, because other markets simply don't have the scale. So the learnings that come from China have a very valuable place in the rule book or a playbook of Indian founders. So these are the three pillars that today have strong presence in Indian economy. Now, where does it have leverage because of all this? I recently analyzed all the minutes of the strategic economic dialogues between India and China for the last 6 years. Or 6 rounds rather. So India has scope to minimize the trade deficit with China and also increase market access for Indian companies. Again, here there are linkages to U.S. China, because U.S. companies might retreat from China. We haven't seen any signs, but if the current trend continues, there might be opportunities for Indian companies in China because of this. And reducing trade deficit is, of course, has been our goal for a long time now. And most importantly, of course, economic ties have acted as a useful hedge against political tensions, right? So now I'll come to the near-term future. India is today at a fork, which I think other panelists have made it very clear. I will not comment on border clashes and the backlash against China and all of that. But on the economic side, let's face it, India is going to have a very tough time recovering from this economic crisis. And any curbs on Chinese investment or trade with China is going to make this more difficult. There's no doubt about it. Self-reliance is a useful goal, but it's a long-term goal. It has to be matched with a lot of action. Second is India's status as a FDI destination. And this is not just for flows from China, because if any big player comes to India, the supply chain that comes will also have Chinese companies. So this is, I think, a matter of nuance, which needs to be understood. We can't pick and choose supply chains to come to India which doesn't have Chinese components. It's simply not possible. So even if we get the OEM customers, which are companies from other countries, there will be Chinese companies down the pyramid. The third one is regulatory development. As a lawyer, I look at this very, very closely. What India has recently done a few weeks ago by asking all Chinese investments to get government approval is the easy way out. It doesn't work. It's not sustainable. We need to develop robust national security screening mechanism. We need to develop competition laws. We need to develop data protection laws. And this is all hard work. So in order to manage the risk brought by Chinese investments, we have a long way to go. And it is better we put our house in order rather than just simply saying, we will just scrutinize Chinese investments. Or even harder is we will first determine what are investments coming from China, because this is no country in the world has done this successfully, determining the nationality of FDI, because money can move in many, many ways. So this is it's a big challenge. And now I'll come to the risk of India actually becoming a theater for U.S. China rivalry. And I say this because today, just a few hours ago, we saw a report that Amazon is now talking to Airtel for a stake sale. And this is closely followed after the Facebook stake in Jio. And the reason why I say this has very important implications is because today Indian founders and Chinese venture capital funds feel that they were the first ones to look at India. They were the first ones to teach you and me how to use e-commerce websites. It's Chinese investors' money which has burnt in India to change our habits. And today they see this as the big giants of Indian industry and US industry coming together to take advantage of the market which has been created in the last 5 to 6 years. So this is actually a real danger, and it might have many other repercussions. It might discourage Indian entrepreneurs who see, if I build a company for 5 years and then the big business houses are just going to come and take away the market after I do all the hard work. So this is something India has to think very carefully. And the last one, I think here, most China watchers might acknowledge this, that if India has concerns with Chinese investments or trade with China, it is better we address them on our own footing. It is better we articulate those interests, and which we have done in the past, and China has given us room for maneuvering wherever they felt and they agreed with us. But in the current scenario, the biggest fear is that if we see that there's a global backlash against China and we simply try to piggyback on it without really making sure we are speaking on our own behalf, then it will become much more difficult for India to preserve its economic ties with China or to benefit from them, both in the domestic scenario or back in China as a market. So I think these are my views, and I'm happy to take questions and go and further elaborate on everything that I have specified so far. Thank you.
Thanks, Santosh. Thanks a lot. That's very helpful. But before I go to the other panelists with questions, just in 30 seconds, all the rage in India seems to be as one of the key opportunity markers that most economists and certainly a lot of our elected leaders seem to be talking about is the diversification strategy in terms of supply chains. Do you actually, in your analysis in 30 seconds, do you actually see large American companies or large European or Western companies in China unplugging and coming to India?
In the near term, no. It will depend on a lot of variables. Like India has to create a domestic environment conducive for FDI, and if Chinese investors are doing it, other foreign companies might be able to replicate it. But coming to your, pulling away from China is not easy. In the last 2 weeks, I have seen Nestle and Volkswagen actually doubling down on their investment plans in China. The only real MNC which has pulled out of China has been Samsung. So yes, it is possible. Theoretically, it's a possibility, but India really has to do a lot of work to convince the world to make India a feasible option for China.
Thanks, Santosh. And I'm just going to now try and bunch the questions and take it to the panelists. If I can ask you to be somewhat pithy with your answers, then we can get a lot more into the discussion. So if I can just start with Paul. Paul, you've got a question from Amy Kasman at the Financial Times and Mr. Rogotham. And their questions are these. One, how do you think China sees India today? Number two, what, according to you, motivates assertiveness on the border? And lastly, what do you make of China's internal situation right now? There's a lot of speculation about Xi Jinping, the PLA. Is it strong? Is he pivoting to these new realities in Hong Kong, Taiwan, India, primarily because of internal circumstances? Any comments on that?
Sure. I think, let me start with the last question first. In terms of, Chinese internal, can you say the last question again, Rudy, in terms of the internal domestic dynamics?
I think the question is essentially, how consolidated is Xi Jinping today? A couple of years ago, I think no one would even question sort of internal stability in China, but today people do.
Well, let me say that, we were watching closely in the early days of the coronavirus situation, where there clearly was an effort to suppress information. Doctors that had come forward, in particular Li Wenliang and others, were, detained and asked to apologize, and their information did not get forward. And that got out to the Chinese public. There was quite a bit of dissatisfaction and anger. But I have to say that given the way the Chinese government then recovered and the successes that they have had in the mitigation and containment phase of the virus, combined with the way that governments around the world, and in particular my own government, the United States, seem to be ill prepared in dealing with the virus, this has all bolstered Xi Jinping's standing in the United States, and in China. And I think that the public support for Xi Jinping is fairly strong. There's a pride in China in how they navigated the coronavirus, especially as the Chinese propaganda apparatus amplifies what is going on in the US and in other parts of the world, in where countries are having difficulties dealing with the coronavirus, or where leadership is not as strong as was on display in China, in terms of the actions being fairly robust, draconian in some measures, but nevertheless stabilizing the situation in China. I think this has helped Xi Jinping. I think the difficulty that, and I would argue that in the U.S. China context, you see a similar dynamic between President Trump and President Xi. President Trump needs external enemies. That's the way he gins up his base. Right now, he is, because he feels vulnerable on his handling of the coronavirus, is using China as the scapegoat, and the World Health Organization. The Chinese leadership is not that much different in that it needs external hostile forces. It uses that in its propaganda effort to gin up support, nationalistic type support from Chinese people. And right now, the Chinese leadership is also pushing a very strong narrative that deflects any blame or criticism of China and focuses it more on the successful efforts of the mitigation and containment phase and the heroic efforts of international aid and assistance to the global community. That's the narrative that President Xi wants. President Trump wants the narrative that it's all China's fault. I think where China is having some difficulties And it was alluded to by our previous speakers. I think Santosh and Tanvi also mentioned it, is the anti-China sentiment that is growing globally. The Ministry of State Security, that's China's top intelligence agency, the think tank affiliated with that, published a report that warned the Chinese leadership that the global anti-China sentiment right now is at its highest since 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown. And we're seeing pushback, not just from the United States, but from a number of countries in the world, in Europe and in Asia, across the globe, where there is growing concern about China's policies, actions, rhetoric. In the US, there is bipartisan concern, both Democrats and Republicans, around the current trajectory of Chinese politics, economics, the international approach, ambitions on technology that seek to put China in a dominant position at the expense of others, and this wolf warrior kind of coercive foreign policy practices that we are seeing emerge. Those concerns also are being expressed by other countries in the world. And what makes the situation worse is that there is not a lot of self-reflection in China. They account this growing pushback to US efforts to convince the world that China is nefarious, or they account this growing pushback to a global misunderstanding of China. And if that's the level of self-reflection that China is going to display when receiving this pushback, I think it's going to be difficult. Tanvi mentioned that China can help shape, through its own actions, the way the world sees China. And I think that's true, but I think they're not doing a very good job right now in convincing the world that their rise is not a threat. In terms of how the U.S., I think the question was, how does China see its relationship with India and motivations along the border?
So Paul, I think just on that, I think it's just a question of how do you think China just views India? And, in terms of, has that changed? Is there something more to India in Beijing today? I mean, that's certainly the case with Xi Jinping, the Wuhan summit, his relationship with Prime Minister Modi, but is that just optics, or has something fundamentally changed in the way they see India?
I think China has a very pragmatic. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. I think, China has I would say, a pretty pragmatic approach to India, and trying to, work with India where they see common interest, especially on trade and economic issues. Obviously, there's tensions on the border, and those, as General Narasimhan was talking about, will pop up from time to time. And I think in this latest case, we have to ask the question, did China see an opportunity, given the coronavirus and given the world's attention is shifted, to try to advance objectives in other areas? I've not watched it closely enough to know whether that is the case or not, but we have seen that in other areas, namely on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, and in other areas where we see a more opportunistic approach by the Chinese leadership trying to seize strategic opportunities. I think we may have lost Rudy.
I think we might have. I mean, I just, one of the things, Paul, just while we're waiting for Rudy, I think, it is interesting in terms of the perception. And I agree with you about China not doing a good job. And I think India is of shaping sentiment. And this goes to something Santosh said as well, which is, the opportunities for China and India. And if you think back to the last few years and missed opportunities in China and India, especially in economic relationship, but also in terms of the political relationship, I think what you see is that today, between a combination of Indians upset about what they see, many Indians seeing them, having to be stuck at home in a lockdown, one of the strictest in the world, because of what happened within China, at least that's the narrative, that they are upset, combined with that, what's happening at the boundary. And if there starts to build a sense in India, much like you said about, throwing stones at us while going down a well, if Indians start to think that China was doing this, using the opportunity of while India is still tackling COVID to do that, you will see kind of anti-China sentiment, the kind of don't knows, the 25% who say we don't know what we feel about China. I suspect that'll shrink and you will see intensify. And where it makes the differences, I mean, you could have seen a Xi Jinping when Prime Minister Modi first came to office saying, I want to do all these things, investment in manufacturing, infrastructure, digital space. And that's just not fructified. And we've actually seen, instead of economic ties hedging against or mitigating political differences, while India-China economic ties have intensified, we've actually seen the 4 major boundary incidents that General Narasimhan talked about. So we have not seen China take advantage of the opportunity and actually reach out and say, okay, let's give India more market access, et cetera, that could mitigate some of those differences.
I think that's right. And I would add, you mentioned in your comments, what happens after the November elections will have a big impact. And I think that's right. While I do think, and I can talk about this later, that there may be some unrealistic expectations in China in particular for what a Biden administration might mean, I think that we would see a much greater effort and a framework similar to what you laid out, which I think is a very pragmatic and smart framework, which is an effort, yes, recognizing greater competition in the relationship and a need to push back more robustly on certain Chinese policies and efforts that run the risk of undermining our interests. But at the same time, I think you'll see an effort to work together where there's common interest, in particular on climate change. But where there are concerns and where there is growing frustration with China, I think a Biden administration would, as you talked about, reach out to international partners and allies and countries who have common concerns and try to forge a more effective and collective type approach in dealing with these areas where the global community is seeing policies, actions, rhetoric from China that they find alarming. And so the one area where I think, many Chinese would hope for a Biden presidency, but in some sense, you might see a more effective policy in terms of pushing back, and we've seen from the Trump administration. I think, frankly, what we've seen from the Trump administration has not been necessarily an effective strategy. It is a strategy that has highlighted some of the threats that are emerging from China, but it hasn't been effective in dealing with those, in my view.
Hello. As we wait for Rudy, I think I'll pose some questions from the chat box to General Narasimhan. I think he has agreed to answer some question already, so I'll just start from that. General Narasimhan, I think this is a question which says, I was hoping a bit more from you to fit the theme of this webinar. What are India's choices in the current U.S.-China imbroglio? And secondly, 3 years ago, I had argued with the power asymmetry with China growing fast. We need to work on coalitions of common objectives. So do you think the time has come now, as suggested by Ambassador Shamsaran?
Yeah, I think it is Ambassador Goyal who has asked this question. I noted it down.
Yes, Ambassador Suresh Goyal, yes.
Yeah. I tend to agree with Tanvi on this, in the sense that I think it is not going to be something like a coalition which will come up or an alliance which will come up. I think that is at this point in time doesn't seem to be workable. What I feel is something on issue-based kind of support is likely to come, and interested parties could come together on an issue-based thing. Like, for example, today you saw the joint statement between Australia and India. It gives a certain amount of direction as to what they want to do. I think on issue-based things, it is going to work. That is the way I see it, at least in the near future. this kind of coalition, etc., I think we are still some way off at this point in time. Are there any other questions you're going to ask? I can take 2-3 more questions on this, which I have noted down.
Sure. General Narasimhan, if you have noted down the questions you would like to answer, please go ahead, because I'm just trying to pick it from the chat box here.
Okay. There were a couple of questions on the map sharing, on the strategic or tactical logic of this present incident that is going on. And third thing is what will be win for India in the medium term? That is something which one can try and answer. And I have a couple of more, if time permits, I'll answer that also. One is the strategic or tactical logic. I don't think it is a strategic logic at this point in time. It is still at the tactical level. It is still at the aim, with the aim of probably getting the correct fix on the LAC on ground. It is something like that is happening. And so I wouldn't attribute it to a strategic kind of a thing that is going on at this point in time. Second thing is map sharing has been already tried out. In fact, in the central sector, the alignment of the LAC maps were exchanged. And in 2002, when we wanted to exchange the Western sector maps, then the talks broke off and then it never came back onto the table. So map sharing is something which we have tried. But what we are trying to say at this point in time is, let us at least clarify the line of actual control, so that, at least the face-offs, etc., can reduce. And then thereafter, we can talk about the boundary resolution. Boundary question can be resolved. So at the moment, the effort is on to actually clarify the LAC and then see where it takes us from. The win for India in the medium term, that depends on what term that you term as medium term. If you're looking at, say, 5 years, then that's a different view. If it is 10 years, it's a different view. And if you say, for example, anything between 5 to 10 years, what will be win for India? Win for India would be to maintain stability in the relationships between India and China, with India and US, an increased collaboration, increased cooperation kind of relationship, and in the meanwhile, grow economically to the targets that have been described by the government. So that is something which would be win for India at this point in time. As far as the reaching Siachen, there is a question, but I think that is a little far-fetched at this point in time. I don't think we should give much credence to this. Through Eastern Ladakh, crossing over and going and linking up with Siachen is something which is a little far-fetched at this point in time. I'll stop here to give chance to others. If there are any further questions to me, I can answer them.
Thank you, General Narasimhan. Tanvi? Yeah. Hello. Someone seems to have joined the panel.
Yeah, sorry, it's me, Rudra. It's in the age of the kind of internet shutdown. So if I could I don't know if you've covered this, and I'm sorry for the internet loss. But Tanvi, you had a bunch of questions which I wanted to club, and if you've covered this, just crack on with something else. But they were from Shweta Desai, Gautam, Shekhar Sinha, and Mr. Ranganathan. And essentially, the question is quite simple, and you've done a lot of work on this, is that can you plot a graph between the closeness between the US and India and the growing diversification on China and India? I think that's the basic question. Is that because, I remember last year when I was in Beijing on Paul's kind invitation, and a very senior Chinese diplomat told us something quite startling. He said, look, we only have 2 problems with India. At the strategic level, it's the Indo-Pacific and the US. At the tactical level, it's 5G and Huawei. So I was wondering if you could just speak to those concerns. There are about 6 questions plugged together.
Sure, and I see a lot of interest in this kind of question of either, why should India, as General Narasimhan said, these questions that people have about should India go further, declare itself an ally of the US, or should it actually hold back because the US-India relationship concerns Beijing. I think this is something I agree with Ambassador Sham Saran. He recently wrote a piece for the Hindustan Times. Just like, India shouldn't give the US a relation, or any country in the US, Australia, Japan, shouldn't give those countries ability to kind of veto its choices in terms of partnership. It can't allow China to do the same, right? And if China really wants to limit the US-India partnership, what we've seen or seem to have seen in the last few years is it tries to mostly limit that partnership through pressure rather than persuasion. So that's why I said, and we were talking about kind of when you dropped off, that you could have seen a Xi Jinping who actually said, you know what, my bigger concern is the US. Let me actually make, as people have called up for India to make to its smaller neighbors, let me make some kind of perhaps even unilateral concessions that might not take India out of the game, but it will kind of limit what it is willing to do with the US. And we have seen kind of, again, you know, watching from the outside, you have seen India, one of the reasons it does not go further, because it understands that there are certain concerns that China has about the US-India relationship. But I think you're seeing a growing argument now amongst many that, look, India, say, you know, by not having a military quad or a kind of a maritime, you know, a Malabar, including Australia, it was somehow kind of assuaging Chinese concerns or limiting, not doing certain things with the US. But China's doing those things anyway, whether it's pressure at the border, whether it's pressure in India's neighborhood. So then why stop if those relationships, say with the US, Australia, and Japan, have actually given India more leverage with China? And so I've heard this from a number of people in Delhi, that India's relationship with the US has actually given it more leverage with China. And yes, there is that aspect of how far you go. So I think India's tendency to kind of not ally, but align, the logic has always been, look, it's designed to give India to have closer partnerships while not relying on those partnerships to eventually kind of save your skin, because India's logic has usually been that external actors are fundamentally unreliable at the end of the day. And so you have to depend on yourself, which means building capability, but also kind of using those partnerships to say to China, look, you put pressure on me, I can go even further. So be nice. And so you do occasionally see, and I think, for example, on the Chinese side, Wuhan came in the context, but even before Wuhan, the post-Doklam reaching out to India on the part of Beijing came as it was more concerned about President Trump. So that fall of 2017, as China became more uncertain about the US, it actually reached out to not just Delhi, but Tokyo as well. And so you saw that charm offensive, which clearly has ended now. So I think these are this is a fundamentally interconnected triangle, but they also involves other countries. So I think these choices will have to, the kind of strategic choices, if China is concerned about them, it can actually shape these choices. I think maybe to some extent it might be too late, because there is the trust aspect, and there's a lot of mistrust on Indians' behalf on China, and these recent few months will not mitigate any of them. And I think on the Huawei, this plays into the Huawei 5G issue. If Santosh mentioned kind of the tech space. Look, at this point, if India is saying, and I agree with Santosh that it should be a broader investment screening process, regulatory process, et cetera, built out. It shouldn't be, and because it's a broader set of issues, data privacy guidelines, et cetera, protection. But I think if the Indian government at this point is saying that it needs to scrutinize every kind of Chinese investment, how is it suddenly going to say that it trusts Huawei? Which now, if its tech access is cut off, is not even going to be that good in quality. How do you think, and I'm not just kind of the Indian government, but the Indian public is going to say, we trust Huawei? That is something China has to ask itself. So if India kind of doesn't include Huawei down the line, I'm sorry to say, but this is not on India. It's not on the US. It's on Beijing and its behavior.
Tanvi, thanks. And I think that takes us to a question on international standards on 5G and tech. I'm going to bring that to Santosh in a second. But if I can just go back to General Narasimhan. General Narasimhan, you've got three very pointed questions, which is, whatever the win is at the end of this current imbroglio, do you see the status quo ante returning to 1 April 2020, sir?
The talks are actually aiming at that. You need to go back to status quo ante that was existing before these incidents that have come up, and also continue with the plan for the infrastructure development as per the plans. So that is being worked around, and I think there is a fair chance that it will happen, and we hope that it should finish in that manner. There are a lot of indications towards that, which I wanted to point out. One is, if you look at the kind of statement that have come out of spokespersons from Beijing, If you look at the statement that have come out of the Chinese ambassador in Delhi, and also, as I was mentioning to you, on the ground level, other than the first instances where the aggressive behavior was seen, there has been hardly any kind of aggressive behavior thereafter. So, and the talks which are happening at various levels, all these are indicative of a process that it's not escalating, if not at least resolved. So hopefully, by the time these talks and all take place, hopefully we should be able to resolve this crisis, resolve this incident, and then get back to status quo ante as it was existing before.
Okay, so thank you so much. We're almost on the clock, and I lost about a couple of minutes in between, so I apologize again. But Santosh, if I can just ask you very quickly, recently the UK moved to an idea of essentially creating a 5G alliance, which they said included India. Now, clearly, this is not something that's going to help Sino-Indian relations or even some of our economic relations. I mean, there are telcos in India who rely greatly on Chinese capital, on Chinese technology, whether it's in Asia or Africa. So how do you think that's going to play out very quickly? And that's a pointed question from Mr. Paul from Tokyo.
Sure. So I will just simply answer by saying India there's no doubt about it, is an ascending economic power. And we have a disproportionate amount of leverage when it comes to these kind of issues. We need to make use of it. We need to set standards. We need to decide what's good for our market. And as Tanvi was saying, if Huawei can't make it in India, it will be a failure on China. So we need to give level playing field, and by prescribing what exactly we expect. Today, we are not doing that. We are trying to take a stance on the basis of its origin and so on and so forth. So the larger point here is India is proving ground for many Chinese companies because they can't succeed just because of capital. They actually need to compete in India. And the more India provides this level playing field, the stronger it gets in all respects, whether vis-a-vis US or vis-a-vis China. We need to build our systems in anticipation of our rise, maybe 20 years from now when we will potentially be the second largest economy. So that hard work has to start now. And the irony is that the playbook for this was written by China, who started 30 years ago, and they decided how to absorb technology from foreign investors. India needs to learn. So if Huawei comes, we need to have a set of conditions so that Indian companies absorb whatever technology it has over a period of time. So I think that is the kind of playbook I would like to see India develop. And that will, I think, have answers to all these questions down the line. And today, this anti-China backlash is as good as any starting point for us to embark on this long-term nation-building effort.
Thanks so much. And Paul, if I could just ask you to finish, we've talked a little bit about how Biden perhaps sees China, but I was just wanting to finish up, and given that it's US elections in a couple of months, or we hope so, how does Biden see India?
Sorry, I was muted. I'm not sure I'm well positioned to answer that question, except to say, put it in the context of what I said previously, that I think you'll see a greater effort by the Biden administration to work with international partners, and I would put India on top of that list. I think that one of the things the Trump administration has not done a very good job at is the work with its allies and partners around the world in a way, frankly, that is in our self-interest to do so. Having strong alliances, having strong partnerships with like-minded countries, other democracies, other market economies, countries where we share values, we should be, fostering those relationships and working those relationships to the bilateral benefit, but also to our own self-interest. And I think you will see, a more constructive approach, I would imagine, by Vice President Biden if he's elected. I think you will also see him try, in addition to restoring relations with key partners around the world, he will invest time in reestablishing U.S. leadership in multilateral forums, something this administration has not done. and reopen important channels that have been closed down during the Trump administration. And so I think he will value and put a priority on the India relationship for a number of reasons that I've already described. And I think it will be an important relationship, I would imagine, for the Biden administration.
Well, thanks a lot. And I think on that kind of optimistic note, and it's bang at 2100 hours here in India, I'd like to thank our panelists. It was good to be with you for the first 75 minutes and then to hear you for the remaining 15 minutes. So Paul Haenle, Lieutenant General Narasimhan, Dr. Tanvi Madan, Santosh Pai, thank you so very much. And thank you to our audiences for joining us from different parts of the world. There are a number of questions which have remained unanswered. We'll do our best to try and see if some of the participants might be kind enough to give some of their comments, which we can relay to you. Apart from that, stay tuned to the India and the World series and take care and stay safe. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Rudy. Thank you.
Rudy, thank you very much.